The road leading into Alder Creek was cracked and overgrown, as if nature itself had given up on this forgotten town. Eli squinted through the windshield at the faded welcome sign, the paint chipped and peeling. "This place looks like it's straight out of a horror movie," he joked, but the edge in his voice betrayed his nerves. Mia rolled her eyes from the passenger seat. "That's the point, remember? We're here to prove that Bigfoot is just a story." Jordan, slumped in the back seat with a beer in hand, grinned. "Or we find it and make history. Either way, I'm down." They pulled into the center of the tiny town, if you could even call it that. There were no signs of life, just a few dilapidated buildings, most of them boarded up. The streets were empty, eerily quiet except for the occasional gust of wind that kicked up dust and debris. A few figures stood in the distance, but none of them acknowledged the trio's arrival. It was as though they had stepped into a place forgotten by time. Eli tried to laugh it off. "Come on, it's just a small town. Probably not used to outsiders." "Yeah, or they're hiding something," Jordan muttered, looking out at the vacant windows, each one like a dark eye watching them. After a brief pit stop at a decrepit gas station to ask for directions, the friends drove another mile outside of town to their destination, an old logging camp. The remnants of Alder Creek's long-abandoned industry stood like decaying giants, rusted machinery half swallowed by the encroaching forest. They parked the car, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. As they unloaded their gear, the forest seemed to loom closer, shadows deepening under the thick canopy. Eli caught a whiff of something sour and rotten but dismissed it. Probably a dead animal, he thought. He didn't want to spook Mia, who was already nervous. Mia knelt beside the fire pit, arranging the kindling while Jordan cracked open another beer. The sun was beginning to sink behind the trees, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The light filtering through the branches had an unnatural quality, a kind of distorted twilight that set Eli on edge. "You hear that?" Mia asked suddenly, pausing mid-movement. Eli glanced around. "Hear what?" "That." She pointed into the forest. "It's heavy. Like something big is moving around out there." Eli strained his ears but heard nothing unusual. Just the usual rustling of leaves and distant chirps of crickets. He smiled at her, trying to ease the tension. "Relax. It's probably just a deer or something." But as the fire crackled and they settled into their makeshift camp, the sounds of the forest grew louder. The usual night noises, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, faded away, replaced by something far more sinister. Heavy footsteps crunched through the underbrush, the snapping of branches too thick to be wildlife. And then the smell returned, that same rancid odor, stronger now, like something long dead was rotting nearby. "Jesus," Jordan muttered, standing up. "What the hell is that smell?" Mia clutched her arms, her face pale. "We need to get out of here." Eli turned on his flashlight and scanned the tree line. His heart skipped a beat when the beam caught a pair of eyes, reflecting back at him from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. He saw the vague shape of something massive, taller than any man, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. "Mia, pack up the tent," Eli said, his voice tight with fear. "We're leaving, now." Mia scrambled to gather their things, but she was moving too slowly. The noises from the woods grew louder, the footsteps coming closer, faster, accompanied by a low, guttural growl that made Eli's blood run cold. The creature burst from the trees with terrifying speed, smashing through their camp like a wrecking ball. The tent was flung into the air, and the fire was scattered in a shower of sparks. In the chaos, Eli lost sight of Jordan. "Jordan!" Mia screamed, her voice rising in panic. Eli spun around just in time to see something huge, covered in thick, matted fur, lunge out of the shadows and grab Jordan by the throat. There was no time to react. Jordan let out a strangled cry before the creature yanked him back into the darkness. The sound of bones snapping echoed through the woods, followed by a sickening wet crunch that made Eli's stomach lurch. Mia was already running, tears streaming down her face as she bolted for the tree line. "Come on!" she cried, her voice trembling with terror. Eli grabbed the remaining gear and sprinted after her, the flashlight beam shaking wildly as he ran. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. Behind them, The creature followed, crashing through the underbrush with inhuman speed. It was toying with them, Eli realized. It wasn't just hunting, it was herding them, pushing them deeper into the forest, cutting off any chance of escape. Mia stumbled over a fallen log, her ankle twisting as she hit the ground. Eli skidded to a stop and pulled her to her feet, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We have to keep moving," he urged. But no matter how fast they ran, the creature was always just behind them, close enough for Eli to hear the wet rasp of its breath, the sickening scent of decay filling the air. They burst through the trees and into a clearing, a narrow stream cutting across their path. Mia was limping now, her face twisted in pain. But she pushed forward, splashing through the shallow water. Eli was right behind her when he heard it. A heavy thud, like a tree falling. He turned just in time to see the creature leap from the shadows, its claws sinking into Mia's shoulders. Her scream pierced the night as she was ripped backward into the trees. Eli froze, his mind numb with shock. The world around him seemed to slow to a crawl. He watched helplessly as Mia disappeared into the darkness, her screams cutting off abruptly, leaving only the sound of his own ragged breathing. He stumbled forward, desperate to reach her. But when he reached the spot where she had been dragged away, there was nothing left but blood. Dark, glistening pools of it soaked the ground, staining the leaves and the dirt. He gagged, his stomach churning at the sight. Jordan's mangled body hung from a nearby tree, his torso split open, his organs spilling out like grotesque garlands. His head had been twisted at an impossible angle, his wide eyes staring blankly into the night. Eli staggered back, bile rising in his throat. His flashlight flickered, the beam weakening as the battery began to die. He was alone now, utterly and completely alone. The creature was still out there, watching him, waiting. He could feel its eyes on him, hear its heavy breathing in the darkness. He had no idea where the path was anymore. The forest had swallowed it, leaving him lost, disoriented, and terrified. The scent of rot clung to the air, thick and choking. And somewhere in the shadows, the creature circled him, closing in. Eli did the only thing he could. He ran. Eli stumbled through the thick undergrowth, his legs heavy and uncooperative. Every breath burned in his throat, and every muscle screamed for rest, but he couldn't stop. The darkness pressed in on him from all sides, dense and suffocating. And that god-awful stench of rotting flesh clung to the air like a curse. Behind him, he could hear it, the relentless sound of something massive moving through the trees, always just out of sight. The forest had grown impossibly quiet. No birds, no insects. Just the crunch of leaves under his feet and the occasional snap of a branch far too thick to break naturally. Eli glanced over his shoulder, his heart racing. He knew the creature was there, lurking just beyond the edges of the dying flashlight beam. He could feel its eyes on him, cold and calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He tripped over a root, falling hard into the mud, and for a moment he lay there, gasping for air. His body trembled, both from the cold and from fear, as he pushed himself to his knees. "Get up," he whispered to himself, his voice a rasp. "Get up, or you're dead." He staggered to his feet, wiping blood and dirt from his face. His flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering weakly. He couldn't remember how long he had been running, but it felt like hours. The relentless pursuit had worn him down, and the horror of what had happened, what he had seen, played on an endless loop in his mind. Jordan's mangled body hanging from the tree. Mia's screams cut short as the creature tore her apart. Eli swallowed hard, bile rising in his throat. He had to keep moving. If he stopped, if he gave in to the fear and the fatigue, he knew he would end up like them. Just another piece of flesh dangling from the trees, a grisly trophy for the monster that stalked him. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement in the trees ahead. Eli froze, his heart skipping a beat as the shadows shifted unnaturally. Something was there, watching him from the underbrush, just beyond the reach of his light. He spun around, scanning the forest, but the shadows were too thick, too oppressive. He couldn't tell where the creature was anymore. It could be anywhere, everywhere. Panic clawed at his mind, and for a moment, he was paralyzed with terror. Then came the sound of rushing water, faint but steady. Eli's heart surged with hope. There had been a stream earlier when he and Mia had run. Maybe it was nearby. Maybe he could follow it, find some kind of path. He stumbled toward the sound, moving as fast as his legs could carry him. The trees began to thin out, and in the distance, he caught sight of a small, dilapidated cabin, half hidden by the thick vines and foliage. Eli hesitated for only a second before rushing toward it. He reached the door, throwing it open with trembling hands, and practically fell inside. The door slammed shut behind him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was silence. He leaned against the door, panting, his heart hammering in his chest. The cabin was dark and smelled of mildew and decay. The roof sagged in places, and the walls were covered in thick layers of dirt and grime. But it was shelter, temporary relief from the nightmare outside. Eli's breathing slowed as he surveyed the room, his flashlight flickering weakly. The interior was bare except for a broken table and a few scattered pieces of debris. He took a step forward and felt something crunch under his boot. Slowly, he shined his light downward and recoiled in horror. Bones. Human bones. Some still had scraps of dried flesh clinging to them. Skulls, limbs, fragments of people who had been here before him. Their remains littered the floor like discarded refuse, arranged in grotesque patterns that seemed almost deliberate. There were symbols etched into the walls, crude and twisted, painted in dried blood. He wasn't the first to take refuge here. And from the looks of it, they hadn't lasted long. His stomach churned at the sight, but there was no time to think, no time to process. Outside, the creature was still hunting, still waiting. He had to keep moving, had to find a way out of this nightmare. The door rattled behind him, and Eli's heart nearly stopped. He turned, pressing his back against the far wall, his flashlight held out like a feeble weapon. The door creaked open slowly, inch by inch, until it revealed the darkness beyond. A moment of silence hung in the air, thick with anticipation. Then something slammed into the cabin with a force that sent the walls shaking. Eli cried out, dropping the flashlight as he stumbled backward. The door burst open, and the creature lunged into the room, its massive form filling the doorway. It stood over 9 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur that glistened with blood. Its eyes burned with a savage intelligence, and its lips curled back to reveal jagged, yellowed teeth. Eli scrambled for the flashlight, his fingers slipping on the slick floor. The creature let out a low, rumbling growl as it stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under its weight. Eli could hear its breath, wet and ragged, like it was savoring every second of his fear. In a blind panic, Eli darted toward the window, crashing through the brittle glass and landing hard on the ground outside. Pain shot up his side, but he forced himself to his feet, blood dripping from fresh cuts on his arms and face. Behind him, the creature let out an ear-piercing screech, a sound that was both animal and something far worse. Eli ran again, his lungs burning with exertion. He could hear the creature tearing through the cabin behind him, ripping apart the walls as though they were made of paper. It wouldn't be long before it was on him again. His leg throbbed with pain, and every step felt like fire shooting up his spine, but he kept going, his vision swimming. He was delirious now. Images of Jordan and Mia flashing before his eyes, their mutilated bodies suspended in the trees like grotesque ornaments. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift and warp, the forest distorting around him, twisting into a labyrinth of nightmarish proportions. Then, in the distance, he heard it, Jordan's voice. "Eli, help me!" The voice was faint but unmistakable, cutting through the silence like a knife. Eli stopped dead in his tracks, his heart pounding in his ears. His rational mind screamed that it was impossible. Jordan was dead, ripped apart in front of him. But there it was again, echoing through the trees. "Eli, please." "No, you're dead," Eli whispered, his voice shaking as he backed away from the sound. "You're dead. I saw you die." But the voice persisted, pleading, desperate. "Please, Eli, don't leave me." Against his better judgment, Eli turned and stumbled toward the sound, his mind a haze of confusion and exhaustion. He had to see. He had to know. Maybe, just maybe, he hadn't seen what he thought he had. He broke through a dense patch of trees and into a small clearing. There, in the center of the clearing, stood a figure. It was Jordan. Or at least, it looked like him. But something was horribly wrong. His skin hung loose and pale, his eyes vacant and unblinking. His body was covered in jagged cuts, blood dripping from his open wounds, but he was standing there, arms outstretched. "Eli," Jordan croaked, his voice hollow and wrong. "Help me." Eli's breath caught in his throat. He stepped back, shaking his head. "No. No." And then he saw it. The skin. The creature had skinned Jordan's body and was wearing it like a grotesque disguise. The jagged wounds weren't injuries, but deliberate cuts where the flesh had been peeled away, leaving muscle and sinew exposed. The thing wearing Jordan's skin tilted its head, watching Eli with that same cold intelligence. Mia's screams rang out from the forest, high and desperate. Eli knew it wasn't her, knew it was just another trick, another mind game. But that didn't stop the terror from consuming him, gnawing at the last shreds of his sanity. He ran again, leaving behind the clearing, leaving behind the twisted remains of his friends. He didn't know where he was going anymore. He just knew he had to keep moving. The trees closed in around him, the darkness swallowing him whole. But he couldn't escape the feeling that the creature was always there, just beyond the edge of the light, watching, waiting, toying with him. It was no longer a matter of if it would catch him, but when. Eli ran until his legs gave out, collapsing onto the forest floor. The earth was cold and damp beneath him, the scent of blood and decay thick in the air. He could feel the creature's presence closing in, could hear its heavy footsteps crunching through the leaves. And then everything went still. Eli lay on the cold ground, his breath shallow and uneven. His legs were useless beneath him, numb from exhaustion and the biting cold that had settled over the forest. The distant sound of rushing water still teased his ears, but it felt like a cruel joke now. He knew he wouldn't make it, not with the creature so close. He could hear it breathing, low, guttural, almost mocking, as it circled him from the shadows. The air was thick with the stench of rot, of blood and death. The memory of Jordan's skin hanging off that monster's hulking frame replayed in his mind. And Mia. The way her screams had been silenced in an instant, replaced by the sickening sounds of her body being torn apart. He was alone now. Truly alone. But why hadn't it killed him yet? The question gnawed at Eli's mind as he forced himself to his feet, staggering forward. The creature had every opportunity to finish him off, yet it kept pulling back, toying with him like a predator savoring the thrill of the chase. What did it want? The answer came sooner than he expected. The trees ahead of him began to thin, revealing a clearing bathed in pale moonlight. At its center, an ancient stone circle stood, weathered by time, but undeniably deliberate. Bones littered the ground around the stones, some old and yellowed with age, others fresh and glistening with gore. And at the heart of it all was a large stone altar, its surface stained dark with dried blood. Eli's stomach churned. This wasn't just a hunting ground. It was a place of ritual, a place where sacrifices were made. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he stepped into the clearing, every instinct screaming at him to turn and run. But his legs wouldn't obey. The creature had driven him here. He had no choice. The ground beneath him felt colder, almost electric, as though he had crossed some invisible threshold. Then he saw them, the townspeople. They emerged from the shadows, their faces blank and emotionless, their clothes worn and dirty. Men, women, even children. All of them moved silently into the clearing, forming a circle around the altar. Eli's blood ran cold as he recognized some of them. The gas station attendant, the old man he'd seen sitting on the porch when they first arrived, even a couple of kids from the street. They stood there, watching him with dead eyes, like puppets waiting for someone to pull their strings. What is this?" Eli croaked, his voice hoarse from screaming and crying. No one answered. They simply stared, their faces pale in the moonlight, their eyes hollow. It was like they had done this before, many times before. Then, From the center of the group, a figure stepped forward. A tall man in a sheriff's uniform, his badge tarnished and dull. His eyes, too, were empty, devoid of any life or warmth. He looked at Eli like he was nothing more than cattle being led to slaughter. "It's been a long time since we've had a good harvest," the sheriff said, his voice low and gravelly. "You shouldn't have come here, boy." Eli's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. "What are you talking about? What the hell is happening?" The sheriff's lips curled into a cold smile. "The creature. It's older than you could ever imagine. It's been here long before this town was even built. And we made a pact with it a long time ago. We feed it, and in return, it leaves us in peace. Doesn't touch a hair on our heads." Eli's heart pounded in his chest. You feed it? With people? Outsiders?" The sheriff nodded slowly, as if explaining something obvious. "A sacrifice every season. 3 souls to keep the peace. You and your friends. Well, you're the offering." Eli's knees buckled, and he nearly collapsed. "You're sick," he whispered, his voice cracking. "All of you." "It's the way it's always been," the sheriff said simply. "And it's the way it will always be." A rustling sound came from the edge of the clearing, and Eli's stomach dropped as the creature stepped into the moonlight. Its hulking form towered over the stones, its fur slick with blood. But this time, it wasn't hiding in the shadows. It was here to claim its prize. The townspeople parted silently, giving the creature a clear path to the altar. Eli backed away, but his legs gave out, sending him sprawling onto the ground. He tried to crawl, but the earth beneath him felt like quicksand, dragging him toward the altar. The creature moved slowly, deliberately, savoring the moment. It approached Eli, its glowing eyes locked onto him with an unsettling intelligence. Its breath was hot and rancid, its teeth gleaming in the pale light. Eli could feel his sanity slipping away as the thing loomed over him. He was lifted off the ground effortlessly by the creature's massive claws, his body dangling helplessly in the air. He screamed, thrashing in its grip, but it was no use. The creature carried him to the altar, laying him down on the cold stone with a kind of reverence, as though he were a sacrifice being prepared for some ancient god. Eli's mind raced, desperate for a way out, but there was no escape. The townspeople watched silently as the creature stood over him, its claws poised above his chest. He felt the sharp points of its talons press against his skin, drawing thin lines of blood. "No," Eli whimpered. "Please. No." The creature paused for a moment, as if considering his plea. Then, with a swift, brutal motion, it plunged its claws into Eli's chest. The pain was unimaginable, a searing, blinding agony that shot through every nerve in his body. He gasped, choking on his own blood as the creature tore him open, his flesh ripping like paper. The townspeople watched in silence as Eli's body was torn apart, piece by piece, his organs pulled from his chest cavity and laid out on the altar like an offering. His heart, still beating weakly, was the last to be removed. The creature held it aloft, blood dripping from its claws, before placing it on the altar with a sickening squelch. Eli's vision blurred as the life drained from his body. The world around him faded, the sounds of the forest and the murmurs of the townspeople growing distant and hollow. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the creature standing over the altar, its eyes gleaming with satisfaction. The sun rose over Alder Creek, casting long shadows across the forest. The clearing was empty now, the stone altar standing silent and stained with fresh blood. The townspeople had returned to their homes, their expressions calm, their steps unhurried. The cycle had been completed, the creature appeased for another season. At the edge of the forest, a new sign had been posted. "Welcome to Alder Creek. Population 214. And somewhere deep in the woods, the creature watched, waiting patiently for the next group of unwitting travelers to wander into its domain. It knew they would come eventually. They always did. And then the hunt would begin again.